Hello. So this is the second part of the series of lectures that I'm doing on theme 2, which is obviously all about religious change and conflict, etc. throughout 17th century Stuart Britain. So obviously the first one, which I did, was about the Church of England, and I've also by now, and you should also hopefully have had a look at the special episode that I've done, where I basically look at sort of the Protestant spectrum and various different groups that exist and just some kind of basic differences between them, which are worth understanding. So the second part of the sub-theme focuses specifically on that latter part. So again, if you find the kind of different groups a bit confusing and sort of what their kind of various different beliefs are, it might be worth having a look at that video that I've done about the Protestant spectrum. Because the second sub-theme is basically about the growth of religious non-conformity and dissent, and essentially the reasons for that growth throughout the 17th century. So the focus of this theme, as kind of seen in the previous theme, kind of discussed in quite a few different ways, the ways in which the government or the church attempts to clamp down on religious dissent throughout the century. And so the focus of this second sub-theme is on the reasons why ultimately that clampdown really was a failure, or ultimately why, despite the clampdown, there was still a survival of dissent, and actually in many ways a growth of dissent throughout the century. Despite there being these various different periods of sustained persecution. And what I'll say as well before I move on is that as a broad question or focus, I don't find this sub-theme particularly tricky. In fact, I find it a little bit easier actually than the previous one. However, as I mentioned beforehand, the range of different groups that exist, as well as, and this is the really irritating part, the kind of different interchangeable terms that can be used for them can really complicate this topic. In particular, if you're sort of trying to revise using your textbook or revision guide, you'll sort of see a lot of different terms thrown around and used to refer to groups. Sometimes they're the same group, it just doesn't really explain that very well. And so getting lost within that Puritan spectrum, which again, I've got like that short video about, is something which can really kind of confuse with this topic. I think the actual main focus is fairly straightforward, and so I find actually as a topic it is easier than the previous one that I've just done. And so before I do kind of move on, whilst I kind of have briefly dealt with these issues in the Puritan spectrum video, for this topic it's just worth really clarifying a few key definitions and terms. And so the first crucial couple of words to define here are the phrases non-conformist and dissenter. And so the first thing which is worth mentioning is the two are really pretty much interchangeable phrases. They basically mean the exact same thing. So a non-conformist and dissenter is pretty much the same thing. Essentially, yeah. They basically refer to a range of groups. So non-conformist or dissenter isn't one specific group. It's a descriptor which refers to a range of groups, and they can quite simply be defined as somebody who does not conform to the beliefs, practices and rules of the established church, and are therefore not part of the established church as a result. So essentially, a non-conformist or dissenter is not part of the main established state church, or in this particular instance, it's a confessional state as part of the kind of the established Church of England. And as I say, that can be because they don't conform to the beliefs, the practices, all the rules, and so as a result, they're not part of the main church. As a term, though, it can become a little bit confusing, and the reason being is it's a term which later on is used to refer to groups that are non-conformist by choice. So there are certain groups that are non-conformist by choice, and there are groups that are non-conformist because they're forced into it, because they basically get chucked out of the church. So you can be a non-conformist or dissenter if you actually specifically choose to not be a part of the main church, and it can also be somebody who is forced out of the main church because of strictly defined rules in regards to uniformity. So a few examples of the former are groups like, for example, Independents, Quakers, Baptists, etc., whereas groups like Presbyterians want to be part of the main church but get ejected at various different stages. So for that reason, it can kind of get a little bit confusing. So I'm just going to go into a bit of background for this time period in terms of Puritan sects. So the Puritan sects begin to basically emerge, as I mentioned in the very first video, basically during Elizabeth's reign. So they are basically members of the Church of England originally, who oppose Elizabeth's middle way, essentially her kind of compromise solution that kind of seeks to bring together or sort of reconcile Catholic and Protestant beliefs, or rather Catholic traditions and Protestant beliefs. However, they, as I say, initially remain as part of the church, as they still support the Anglican doctrines which reflect their own beliefs. They support Anglican doctrines, but they basically oppose the rituals that retain Catholic features, and so they instead seek to implement a more purified form of worship, even though they accept the core beliefs and doctrines. And so you kind of begin with the kind of slow emergence of Puritans, but then from sort of 1600 onwards begin to see the slow emergence of independent churches. And when I say independent churches, they're pretty much churches, sort of ministers who choose to leave the Church of England to instead set up their own local churches. So that's what we mean when we basically say independent churches. And so you find there are basically a few kind of prominent and significant examples of individuals who leave the church to establish their own independent churches. So there's these two guys, John Robinson and John Smith, who are both educated and ordained together at Cambridge. And they basically gather a few of their followers and they go into exile along with the remnants of a group that had previously been led by a lay preacher, a man called Henry Jacob. And so this group managed to gather enough money in Holland, where they're basically based in exile, to buy a ship, a famous ship known as the Mayflower, which, as you'll know, is basically makes for the America, to basically go there. And they end up creating and founding the first New England colony in 1620. So the New England colony basically is a Puritan colony. And so the church they established there is a model for later settlers who also follow them later on, and also kind of fellow Puritans who go there in the 30s to basically, seeking refuge or as refugees from the reforms that Laud has implemented that has basically ejected them from the church. And so another one of those guys, John Smith, while he's in Holland, he basically adopts Baptist ideas and establishes the General Baptist movement. This other guy, the final guy, Henry Jacob, he moved back to London in 1616, and he creates his own independent church in London. So this gives us a few examples of kind of a few key Puritan preachers or leaders who emerge just before the beginning of our time period, as you start to see kind of the growth of kind of independent dissenting Puritan groups outside of the Church of England. So you have this kind of slow growth and increase before our time period. But then the question then is, how does this kind of slow minority groups gradually become more important, and also how do they survive the persecution or kind of the persecution of the Laud years? And so the first reason why they're basically able to survive is that, and this will be a very similar point when we look at the Clarendon Code of 1660, is that whilst Laud's reforms were meant to crush dissent and establish uniform church doctrines, they actually have the opposite effect. And so opposition to Laud's reforms leads to a growth and survival of dissent and non-conformity. And so in trying to enforce uniformity in very strict Anglican beliefs, they end up, that is sort of Laud bunch, they end up ejecting a range of ministers from the church who were previously quite moderate Puritan ministers. And so as a result, those ministers don't suddenly decide they no longer adhere to their beliefs. They basically begin to meet outside of the church. So in ejecting all these different ministers who refuse to conform to Laud's reforms outside of the church, they basically subsequently increase dissent, because these people then become non-conformists as a result. That's the first thing. And the second point is that the nature of his reforms creates significant opposition, which ends up, as we've seen before, creating this conflict between both the king and Parliament. And so the result of that is that the Long Parliament ends up rolling back many of the changes that Laud had basically implemented, and that as a result basically encourages the growth of independent churches and kind of lay preaching. We say lay preaching as in by individuals who are not ordained ministers. Another reason why people are able to survive the sort of persecution of the Laud years and sort of personal rule, or of course, as I've already alluded to, there is the development of the Puritan colony of New England, which basically meant that after Laud starts trying to enforce uniformity, anybody who basically didn't want to conform was able to essentially avoid ejection and basically lay low during the persecution years by emigrating to the New England colony. And so in terms of numbers, you get quite a significant number of Puritans immigrating there. So in total, you've got about 80,000 Puritans traveling to New England, emigrating for various different reasons in the 30s to basically escape to escape this kind of persecution. And then 20,000 go to New England in search of religious freedom during this decade. And so many of these people are able to just sort of go there and lay low during the Laud years. And then after 1637, when Charles' authority begins to crumble following the Bishops' War, they're basically able to return back to England. And so you find that they weren't really able to crush dissent or non-conformity during this time period. It's simply they sort of lay low for a few years while it kind of went on, and they kind of came back once his authority basically collapsed. So those are kind of the reasons why they're able to survive the persecution of the Laud years. But then you have the reasons why not only does non-conformity survive, it also grows in this period. And the first major reason why non-conformity grows is due to the impact of the Civil War. It witnesses the greatest growth in dissent yet due to a few different factors. The first factor is, of course, what often happens during war, which is that you get a breakdown of normal restraints and kind of controls and sort of law and order. And so as a result, the war allows existing dissenting groups of non-conformists to basically thrive and flourish in a way they previously weren't. So they previously existed but kind of sort of lay low and didn't they weren't involved in their worship more openly and publicly. With the collapse of law and order that the Civil War brought about, the government, obviously the government and the church, aren't able to kind of enforce uniformity in the way that they previously were. And so these groups are able to sort of come out of nowhere and sort of rise and start flourishing. And also it allows a lot of radical ministers to take on responsibilities in parishes or preach in towns that were sympathetic to the parliamentarian side. And so there are a lot more opportunities for radical ministers to basically kind of preach out in the open and in public. And so you witness a growth of non-conformity and dissent. And then the second major reason why the Civil War kind of leads to this growth is the role, or the active role, which the New Model Army plays, or the pivotal role it plays in helping to spread these ideas. And that's because the New Model Army basically acts as a gathering place for the more radical figures due to the nature of the parliamentarian cause. It gathers a certain range of individuals, and they're also, due to the fact that the New Model Army is traveling across the country, they're able to move across to different places, and every single location they go to, they're able to spread their ideas and strengthen existing independent or dissenting churches. And so the new Model Army, whilst the radicalism of it is sometimes exaggerated, it is to some degree kind of an incubator of radical ideas and sort of radical religious sects and dissenters. The follow-up reason, of course, linked to that is then you have the sort of prolonged period of religious toleration and sort of acceptance of dissent that comes about, in particular under the sort of effective reign of Cromwell. And so there is a sort of long-term effect of Cromwell's of policies of toleration. So as we looked at beforehand, he establishes quite broad toleration for any kind of groups that he considers to be non-threatening. And he even allows kind of slightly more crazy groups to actually operate, even though theoretically they're not meant to, but he basically doesn't actually take any active steps to try and clamp down on them. So they're basically allowed to effectively go about their business during his reign. And so what this then does is, in allowing these groups to operate freely and more openly, it gave this freedom gave groups like sort of various different independent and Baptist groups the ability to become more organized and established as groups. As a result, they're often able to kind of set up official national organizations, establish formal belief statements for members to take, and so because they're no longer these basically underground secret churches, they're able to kind of, in becoming more open and free, they're able to utilize that to strengthen their kind of structures and their sort of organizational methods as well. And so what you then find is, even though religious toleration does not last after Cromwell's rule, after the Restoration, these groups were able to take advantage of the Cromwell years to become better equipped and therefore ready to withstand the renewed persecution that comes about after 1660. And so that's sort of the first half of this time frame. We then get the second half of the time period. You get this renewed and arguably even more vicious persecution than ever before after 1660, along with the Clarendon Code and the Restoration. So the high point of persecution in many ways comes after 1660, with the very vengeful Restoration settlement that has kind of a few sort of controversial aspects of it, but the religious element is what really has quite a significant impact. And that's because the High Church Anglicans, or sort of Arminians, once again take charge of the church, and they seek to reimpose the Laudian system that had basically been imposed in the 30s. But unlike Laud, they actually seek to impose it far more aggressively than before. And so this is often referred to as the Clarendon Code. So the Clarendon Code is basically a group of 4 laws that are passed that are sort of designed to impose religious uniformity within the church, and they're collectively referred to as the Clarendon Code. And so there's 4 main acts. And what you'll notice is these acts are kind of implemented one after the other to kind of gradually tighten the net around these non-conformist groups to give them less space to operate. So the first act is the Corporation Act of 1661, which basically bans any non-conformist from municipal office. In other words, these local borough corporations, as I mentioned beforehand, they are the local governments in across the country. So the Corporation Act bans a non-conformist from sitting or occupying office in these borough corporations. The major act, though, comes a year later, which is the Act of Uniformity of 1662. And this essentially formally excludes non-conformists from church offices and results in, I believe, 1,800 ministers being ejected from the church because they cannot conform to to the new standard, the new requirements, or the new oaths and requirements. And so this is therefore designed to eject ministers from the church. But then what you then find is, of course, when you do that, as we've seen beforehand, ministers or groups simply continue to meet outside of the church. And so again, as I've said, the Clarendon Code aggressively targets non-conformists much more than the Laudian reforms had initially done. So the next act which follows is 2 years later, which is the Conventicle Act, which basically, a conventicle is defined as a meeting of more than 5 people, or a religious meeting more than 5 people that are not family members. And so the Conventicle Act forbids any religious meetings of more than 5 people outside of the official church. So any non-conformist meetings are officially outlawed or banned. Of course, once again, you can ban those meetings, but people continue to have them. And so another act is passed, it's pretty much like a cat and mouse kind of game here. They sort of try to tighten the net. Sort of non-conformists find a way to kind of avoid the laws, and then they kind of pass another. So the final significant act that is passed is the 5 Mile Act of 1665. And so what this law then does is it forbids any clergyman who's been expelled or ejected from the church from living within 5 miles of the parish from which they have been expelled. Because again, the point here being that you expel them from their little parish, but then what they then do is they then continue to preach outside of the parish, like not far from there, and people continue to attend. So the 5 Mile Act means they are forbidden from living within 5 miles, and therefore reduces the likelihood of an ejected minister or parish priest being able to continue preaching to his sort of former congregation. And so it ends up being sort of very tight restrictions upon Puritan worship and Puritan preaching, sort of non-conformist preaching rather. And so the question is, how are non-conformists able to survive this persecution after 1660? So you could actually specifically be given a question that is focused just on 1660 to 1688, because there is actually quite a wide range of points you could potentially mention here for such a short space of time. And so the first reason why they're able to survive is because the non-conformist groups themselves actually become quite resilient. And so by the end of the 1660s, the worst was over for the dissenters, who, as I say, had been showing some signs of resilience. And so sort of the first group to look at, Presbyterians, who had now kind of become or had been ejected largely from the church, they had basically developed new networks of personal contacts that allowed them to create informal associations of ministers, sort of as they kind of operated secretly. And then more importantly, more significantly, was the establishing of the academy, or an academy, in 1669 that was designed to educate potential new clergy. And so this has essentially been triggered by the concern over the lack of sort of properly trained dissenting clergy available to support various different worship meetings and prayer meetings. And so both Presbyterians and Congregationalists as groups, whilst they're seen to be slightly radical, they were both generally opposed to the idea of lay preaching. In other words, somebody preaching with no real proper qualifications. And so so as a result, they basically they established this academy which is able to train new clergymen, train them properly. And so this kind of reflects the fact that the Presbyterians had begun to accept the new situation. So they understood that actually the changes that are taking place in the Canon Code were probably going to stay for a while. And so they had begun to actively plan for the future and kind of make themselves resilient against kind of this sort of new situation they found themselves in. And so that's kind of the situation with Presbyterians. Then you also find other kind of dissenting or kind of non-conformist groups that also show some resilience after 1660. Another example of these are, of course, the Quakers. And so the Quakers in particular really faced quite vicious persecution under the Clarendon Code and sort of from 1616 onwards. And various different developments for the Quakers show their strong ability to adapt and survive under those circumstances. So their leaders, for example, at the beginning are basically under, I think it's the Quaker Act has passed, imprisons all their leaders from about 1661 to 1664, which leads to the collapse of their organization and basically their organization being shattered as a result. In 1666, however, their main leader, George Fox, is basically released from prison, and he goes about re-establishing or rather reorganizing the Quakers in a more centralized way to kind of make them more resilient against kind of future persecutions. And so previously different congregations were meant to be self-sufficient. They didn't really require any orders from a central office. You could basically have an independent Quaker meeting or group in a part of the country. They could operate as their own separate group and not really require any contact with other groups. A new system that was put in place by George Fox when he comes out of prison that basically makes the organization more disciplined. And he basically organizes it by placing Quakers under greater control of a central committee in London. And so they basically assert greater national control over their various disparate groups to essentially make them more resilient in the future. And so what you find is that, what you can do is as a result, you can make an argument that one of the reasons why dissent survives this time period is because actual dissenting groups themselves find ways to adapt and become more resilient in face of this persecution. And those are kind of a few of the examples you can mention. The second reason, though, why persecution fails, though, or why dissent survives, is there is a failure by Gilbert Sheldon. Gilbert Sheldon being the Archbishop who is imposing these Laudian reforms. There is a failure by this man Gilbert Sheldon to renew these persecutions after 1669. So a lot of the acts of the Clarendon Code, for example, had initially expired in 1667. And this guy, Gilbert Sheldon, tries to campaign for a renewal, arguing that actually dissent had survived and that it actually begun to organize more effectively. And he sort of goes about trying to prove that actually there is still a wide extent of non-conformist belief and there's need for kind of firm action. And so in 1670, they renew the Conventicle Act and a second one is basically passed, and it basically has the exact same restrictions as the first Conventicle Act, basically by charging fines for anyone organizing a conventicle or kind of a worship meeting of more than 5 people outside the church. But the records, however, show that actually this attempt to renew persecutions by Sheldon has a very limited impact and doesn't really affect that many people. So the question is, why does this happen? And this is partly due to the increased organization of those groups, which we already mentioned. But what this is more to do with in many ways is the change in attitudes of people towards the harassment and persecution of those dissenters. So many people who weren't dissenters basically knew or sort of had close relations with sort of people they knew to be their sort of peaceable and respectable neighbours. And so they increasingly become quite offended by the quite harsh targeting and persecution of these quite respectable individuals in many cases, because as I've said already, the Clarendon Code massively widens the list of targets sort of being chased by the Clarendon Code. And so you get quite a lot of quite decent, ordinary, moderate people who don't seem like the kind of people you want to be targeting religious persecution with. And so it creates quite a lot of resentment and sort of sort of lack of willingness to abide by it amongst large parts of the country. You also, in particular in the church, get the development of groups, some Anglicans called latitudinarians, who are essentially a moderate type of Anglican who believe in allowing some width and scope of belief within the church, that it's actually rational and sensible to allow some variation in beliefs as opposed to imposing strict uniformity. So you have men, for example, like Bishop John Wilkins, who basically argue that persecution was a counterproductive measure and that they shouldn't be following it as a result. And so kind of linked to that, what you also find is that many of those remaining within the church itself, or who remained in the church themselves, were not particularly different in their beliefs to non-conformists who had been ejected. Because as I say, there was a very kind of wide range of people who had been targeted as part of the Act of Uniformity. And so as a result, a lot of the people who actually stayed within the church had actually conformed, but without real enthusiasm. So even people who were conformists weren't conformists because they were sort of massively in favour of Laudian reforms, and the new sort of Laudian reforms that have been imposed again, but had basically kind of conformed just essentially because they had to. And what that meant is many among the ruling class were those who were basically the ruling class were those who were responsible for enforcing these laws, often as a result shared these views. And so people who were tasked with enforcing these changes and these restrictions oftentimes weren't keen on doing so, and in fact beyond that would often extend help to individual ministers. So anybody who'd sort of fallen foul or fallen victim to any of the Laudian reforms were often helped out by sort of like allies they might have, or friends or neighbours. You often, for example, also have rich benefactors providing incomes and accommodations to ejected clergymen to basically continue to preach privately for them and kind of their own for their own private functions. This was mainly Presbyterian ministers, so a lot of the key Presbyterian ministers who were ejected often found private work fairly quickly due to sort of these rich benefactors. But you also sometimes even had independent congregations being extended these privileges as well. And so there are there's quite a few ranges of different examples of ministers who are kind of given these privileges. So I think in your textbook on page 54 at the bottom there's a few different examples of these sort of rich benefactors giving positions to ejected clergymen as a result. And so you find this point that actually people just simply were not keen on enforcing this uniformity, and so it was difficult to actually renew that persecution, even though men like Sheldon wanted to continue it after 1617. The follow-up reason, though, however, is the impact of the Declaration of Indulgence, which we've been over again in previous lectures, and as a result, sort of the role that Charles II plays. So, this sort of temporary suspension of the Clarendon Code in 1672 gives dissenters the freedom to not attend church and meet in their own licensed gatherings. And so this, the Declaration of Indulgence is suspended in 1673, but crucially, it gave dissenters the chance to continue laying their foundations for future development. So part of this is sort of physical foundations. So it gave groups, again, the opportunity to, in the open, sort of build sort of houses, form associations, etc., develop training academies, like physical institutions that would be important for their organization later on. But then the other important point was that it allows groups, like in particular Presbyterians, to take out licenses to preach outside of the national church. And so these licenses were, for the most part, not reversed until after 1675, but some licenses never were reversed. So actually, as a result of the Declaration of Indulgence, some dissenter groups are actually formally allowed to continue worshipping outside of the church for the entirety of the rest of this period, despite persecution officially being renewed after the declaration was suspended. So again, it crucially allows and gives these groups just more time and space to continue developing networks and associations outside of the church. And then linked to it as well, again, it's another example of kind of a lot of these big dissenter groups like Presbyterians formally basically accepting that their future will be outside of the main established church. And so in having such a large group accepting their fate, you have this, again, this natural enlarging of sort of dissenting groups, and some of whom are very organized, established groups as well. And And then, of course, finally, you have, as I say, persecution is renewed again quite aggressively after 1683, which, if you'll recall from the second lecture, is when Charles has this very vengeful attitude following the failure of the Rye House plot. So in many ways, you get the harshest period of persecution, and in some ways, the most successful period after its failure in 1683. And this is because, as I mentioned beforehand, Charles basically considers dissenters to be associated with the Whigs, who had tried to exclude his brother from the succession. And so he therefore renews with a vengeance the attack on the Whigs, these dissenters and their sources of power. But despite the strength of the persecution, because in many ways a lot of the records sort of show a lot of meetings, etc., sort of essentially ceasing to exist during this time frame, this persecution is not permanently successful. So it witnesses the abandoning of religious meetings in certain areas. So there's a couple of examples to say. They cease, for example, to meet in Devon, in West Yorkshire. They only meet at night time. Quakers begin to meet only in very remote areas. So it succeeds in clamping down on dissent quite a lot. But essentially, the persecution ends with the arrival on the throne of James II, who is much more sympathetic to non-conformists as a Catholic himself. And with the ending of persecution, the speed through which dissenting groups basically re-emerge in their worship and their organizations shows that, again, even that persecution under Charles was actually a failure. And so it speaks to this point that despite the strength of persecution, dissenting groups themselves had become much better organized over time and were subsequently able to withstand that persecution. And part of it is always the fact that public opinion had clearly shifted against it. And so again, they very often refused to fully cooperate and carry out orders, which as a result blunted the impact of the persecution, even if they were not able to actually stop it from happening in the first place. So again, there's kind of a few examples that are in your textbook of various kind of individuals tasked with enforcing persecution who basically refused to go along with it. So there's an example of members of the Borough Corporation in Plymouth threatening to basically resign after the courts were ordered to enforce the laws more rigorously. So you again get this kind of refusal to accept this persecution by various different groups. And so in many ways, actually, the failure to sort of clamp down effectively on dissenting groups after 1660 can largely be attributed to the kind of overly strong attempt to enforce it. The problem was they set themselves a overly large, sort of overly ambitious target, or they basically defined uniformity too strictly, which first of all created a massively swelled the numbers of dissenters in the first place, and as a result kind of made them slightly more organized groups. But then also as a result, the nature of the groups themselves that are being persecuted and the kind of extent of that persecution meant that most people refused to go along with it, and ultimately you need the cooperation of the kind of political nation and people in charge of the various different borough corporations to actually enforce that persecution if it is going to work effectively. And that is really ultimately the main overall argument you can use to explain why dissent survives basically throughout the time period and throughout the periods of persecution. And that's then the final point that I'll mention there, and I can leave it on that point. And so again, it's another kind of topic which is not so straightforward to pick out points for, and they can be a little bit complex and tricky. But I think for this one, unlike 2A, there are generally a nice range of points you can pick out, relatively speaking. If there's anything that I've mentioned which kind of, again, is sort of a bit unclear or needs clarification, as always, if you sort of just leave any comments in the, or have any questions, leave them in the comment section below, and I'll try to respond to them when I get a chance. So thank you very much for listening.